So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this kind of mini watercolor sunset landscape in Procreate. As usual, I'll list the brushes I'm using in the description. And to start, we're going to roughly paint on the background colors for the sky. So for the brush, I'm going to switch to the smooth dry round, and I'll do a long press to grab this yellow tone. And I'm basically going to start just below the center line, and I'll do a couple bands like this, just trying to stay within the sketch. And I'll repeat this same process on the same layer, just using the other colors on the color palette. And usually when I do this, I go beyond the sketch. So if you want, you can easily fix it by going to the liquify tool, setting it to push, and you can just push this back in line with the sketch. There we go. Next, I'm going to do some blending. So I'll switch to the background water blender, and I'll just use this to kind of smooth out the transitions between the colors. But at the same time, I'm also going to try to sort of stir up the different colors between the layers just to separate them more. And it's optional, but later on I'm going to put the sun somewhere in this area. So I want to add a sort of radiating effect. So to do that, I'll use the same water blender, just at a smaller size, and I'll kind of scrub it back and forth like this. And then down here where I blended it too far, I'll just cut it back with the eraser. Next, I'll move on and do the clouds, and that's going to be this kind of gray color. For the brush, it doesn't exactly matter, but I think I'll use the Shoto brush. And it's important that these are on a separate layer, kind of above the sky for now. And since I like this kind of radiating sunset pattern, I'm going to blob on clouds like this, just sort of following those lines towards where the sun's going to be later on. Next, I need to adjust kind of the softness of the edges of the clouds, basically just to soften everything up. So for that, I'll switch back to the background water blender, and I'm going to use this in two different ways. So first, I'm going to use it with a pretty hard pressure and just go along the tops of the clouds like this. And the purpose of using it with a hard pressure is to create somewhat of a harsher blended edge on the top of the cloud. And then once that's finished, I'm going to go over the bottoms of the clouds, but this time with a softer pressure, just to make the transition much more softer and gradual. And the end goal with this is basically just to make a bunch of blobs that are slightly softer on the bottom than on the top, but generally they're all very soft with the edges. And next, to kind of finish up the clouds, I just need to do a couple of refinements. And the first one I like to do is just use the kind of warp tool, just to give the clouds an overall warp. I feel like with sunsets, it's really nice when there's a kind of dramatic angle with the clouds, so this gives me a chance to increase that effect. You can see here this kind of curving effect. I think it looks really good. After that, I'll go to my adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll mess with the brightness and the hue a little bit and try to dial these in. Basically, I want them to be slightly darker than the kind of sky in the background, and then the color of them should be kind of a somewhat dull purple tone. And these clouds look pretty good, but if you feel like the colors of the clouds are too similar, there's kind of an optional thing you can do to mix it up a little bit. So this time, I'm going to grab the freehand selection tool, and I'll just make a random selection that kind of goes through the clouds like this. I'll feather it out around 20%. Again, hue, saturation, and brightness, and this time I'll kind of adjust these around just to add a secondary color into the clouds. Now, after all the blending and adjustments I made, you can see some of the clouds went beyond the drawing. So to fix this, I'm just going to temporarily turn off my sketch outline, and then I'll just use the eraser brush to cut the clouds back in line with the painting. Next, we can move on and start working on the foreground. So for that, I'll turn my sketch back on, and the foreground is basically going to be some pretty flat water with some light ripples in it. So it's basically just going to reflect the sky, and there's a couple of tricks I use to get that effect. So first, I recommend kind of roughing up the bottom edge here. So for that, I'll make sure the sky layer is selected, and I'll just use the liquify tool set to push, and I'll just kind of stretch it back and forth just to make it more irregular. After that, I'll just duplicate the sky layer, then I'll use the arrow tool to kind of flip it vertically. I'll move it down and then stretch it and kind of squish it until it fits, just so there's just a little bit of overlap there. If you want, you can also use the warp tool if you want to stretch it. Now at the point where the skies are overlapping, it gets a little bit darker, and I like this effect and I want to enhance it. So I'm going to set the copy here, the sky layer at the top. I'll set the transparency to multiply. It just makes that a little bit darker. Then I'll merge both of the skies together. Then I'll grab my water blender again, and I'll just blend the bottom part of that kind of darker middle section. And once the sky's been kind of reflected down like this, we can do a similar thing to the clouds. So I'll duplicate the cloud layer, kind of using the same trick here, and I'll just move it down. There we go. Now I want to create a sort of rippling effect in what's basically water here. And so that means the clouds are going to be reflected not quite perfectly. There's going to be gaps in the reflection. So to get that effect, I'm just going to erase pretty much straight through the cloud layer. Just kind of back and forth like this, just scribbling. And those are basically the ripples in the water. And this effect is kind of too strong by default, so I'm going to soften it up. So to do that, I'm first going to use the Gaussian blur and just generally blur it. Just a little bit. Then after that, I'll go to motion blur, and I'll blur it quite a bit more, kind of side to side. There we go. And I think these reflections look pretty good. But since we used the motion blur effect, it stretched them kind of beyond the painting again. So just like we did with the clouds on the top, I'll use the eraser brush to cut them back. And with the reflection finished, I think we can finally move on and paint the sun. And this will be on a separate layer above everything. And I'm going to select pure white and the Shoto brush, just because it has a little bit of transparency in it. And I'll start by just drawing a rough circle like this in one stroke. And then I'll do a few more kind of concentric circles as separate strokes. This creates just kind of a slightly softer edge. After that, I'll grab the water blender, and I'm going to soften just the bottom edge of the sun, just barely. Next, I'll use the arrow tool to kind of refine the position. I think that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to do a little bit of glazing kind of around the sun to bring out the contrast. So to do that, I'll make a layer above the sun, and I'll set the transparency to multiply. I want to go back and grab that original yellow color we used for the sky. For the brush, I'll use the water stain glazing brush. And I'm just going to carefully kind of try to frame in the sun. And you can see the kind of dark edge of this brush really brings out the outline of the sun. After that, I'll switch to the water blender, and I'll use it to soften the outer edges here that we don't really need. And it's definitely kind of hard to describe this effect, but I really like how it looks. And at this point, this scene could be finished, but I think I want to add some simple mountains or islands in the background. So to do that, I'll grab this darker color here. I'll make another layer above everything that's also set to multiply. For the brush, I'll use the smooth dry round again. And I'll roughly kind of make this kind of blobby shape just on each side. I think it just kind of bounces this way. After that, I'll use the water blender to soften kind of the bottom edge. And then I'll finish it up with the eraser brush just to clean up where they go beyond the painting. And once again, this scene could be finished at this point, but there's a couple more kind of finishing touches that really improve this. First, I'm going to merge all the layers for the scene together onto one, and then I'll use the liquefy tool set to push, and I'm just going to kind of move everything around a little bit, try to clean up the edges, and especially focus on kind of lining up the horizon and the mountains. And also, another optional thing you might want to do is make the water a little bit sparkly. So for that, I'll make another blank layer above everything, and I'll use the annoying pen brush set to pure white, and I'll carefully trace some kind of sparkly lines like this. And just like that, this simple watercolor sunset is finished. And here's the final result, and I just printed this out with my usual Canon Pixma, and I actually kind of made a bunch of these and printed them out as well. I think there's just something really interesting and cute about these tiny landscapes, and I just thought they were so cool. And that pretty much wraps it up. If you made it to the end, let me know in the comments below. If you think I've earned it, hit the like button. And here are 2 more watercolor tutorials I think you might love to watch next.